Tech Support, a podcast at Mount Juliet Church of Christ where we encourage and equip people to interact with the biblical text. We are your hosts, Brian Lemasters and Tim Martin.
We're excited about starting our new series here about Jesus Christ. The title of it's going to be called The One They Call Christ. And we're going to cover a variety of things and looking at Jesus from less of his particular teachings or sayings or his historical actions, but more from a theological perspective. We're going to start our series with this episode called When Are We? To bring us between the end of the Old Testament narrative and what all happened between then and the time of Jesus that shaped the religious world and the theological world that Jesus lived in. We're also going to look at a few different of our titles, is look at the differences and purposes behind the authors of the four Gospels. What were they trying to get across? What was the point they were trying to make? Because there's differences between those. Some things are included in some and not included in others. We want to talk about Jesus' birth, his family. A big topic that we'll talk about for probably a couple weeks is his deity. What did it mean for him to be God and human? What did it mean for him to be the Son of God? Why did he have to die? Think about what evidence do we have about evidence for Jesus outside of the Bible? And then we'll finish up our series with an episode on why do we believe in Christianity, in Jesus, in his message, in salvation, because I think that's a very important topic that's different from why do we believe in God. You know, there's people that believe in God or believe in a creator or believe in deities, and people have, but why do we believe in this particular thing that the New Testament teaches us?
Yeah, I'm excited about this series. Hopefully this will be beneficial to you. We're not going to really be looking at his teachings and like miracles, things like that, but hopefully asking some questions that maybe we don't think about and talk about as much. So I hope you all join us for this whole series. I think it'll be very beneficial to our faith. So Tim, when we think about Jesus, like we know, okay, he came and lived on earth, but a couple thousand years ago, like we think about the Old Testament and then we jump on the scene in the New Testament. I know today we want you to kind of walk us through understanding like where, when, and where are we in that biblical narrative and what's going on in the world when Jesus enters into the world and becomes flesh.
Yeah, in order to understand what people were expecting of Jesus, like for example, one of the things we'll talk about is what were messianic expectations. That is all shaped, and I think our understanding of the New Testament has to be couched in what happened in the nearly 5 centuries between the end of the Old Testament narrative, which is what we see contained in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Most scholars think they originally were one book, and they have some intertwinings there amongst them. Somewhere in the middle of the 5th century BCE is when we're talking about that time period, and so we'll talk a little bit about how we got there and then what happened in between. I think it's important to understand what happened because the Israelite religion in the time of David and its thought and its institutions and its practices were different in many ways than what we would call Second Temple Judaism, which is the environment that Jesus was brought into, and we want to talk about some of those differences. So do you want to me to summarize, what was happening at the end of the Old Testament and then what happened in between there?
Yeah, let's start there, kind of what at the end of that narrative there. 'Cause hopefully people know this, but like that blank page in your Bible represents about 400 years.
And a lot of political
and a lot of changes.
A lot of religious changes.
Because they're coming out of captivity. So there's just a lot of change that occurred there.
Yeah, we see kind of at the end of like the book of Second Kings and the end of Second Chronicles, we see the northern kingdom of Israel has already been conquered by the Assyrians. The southern kingdom had been conquered by the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar, the guy we see Daniel dealing with, and then they're conquered. The Neo-Babylonians are conquered by the Persian Empire, and so those are things that we see dealt with in the book of Daniel, in the book of Esther, and the Persians are in charge when the Old Testament closes. Nehemiah was a Persian governor, a Persian representative of that, and so were those who were restored.
Tim, you want to explain your title here? Most people probably just are used to hearing the Babylonians.
Well, there's a Babylonian Empire, and there's a New Babylonian Empire. The Babylonians, many people have heard of the Code of Hammurabi, for example. There was a Babylonian Empire, and that's a very, very limited term because it wasn't huge like we generally think about a Babylonian Empire. So generally the time of Nebuchadnezzar's empire and the next couple of kings after him before the Persians ruled them is usually called the Neo-Babylonian Empire. But it's fine to call it the Babylonian Empire or whatever you want to say. But just to differentiate it from a Babylonian civilization that existed well over 1,200 years earlier. That's the only reason I call that Neo-Babylon.
Yeah. Just wanted to make sure people understood the
that there's a difference.
of that, yeah.
Essentially, it's a new Babylonian empire that we see, and not nearly as big as the Persians or the Greeks that follow, but we do have the Persians. They're very merciful. Cyrus II, he's even referred to in Isaiah as the Messiah, the anointed one of God who's going to restore his people. So in about 539, he issues an edict that the Jews can return home if they want to. A lot of them stayed in Babylon. There was a Jewish presence in Babylon for many, many centuries, even probably in that region until today. Not all of them returned, but some of them did. Daniel, for example, stays. And we see Daniel serve under the Babylonian Empire, and we also see him serve under the Persian Empire with references to Darius and the king of the Persians. So they're allowed to return. And then we see the rebuilding of the temple happens in that time because it had been destroyed in 586. And we see it rebuilt and rededicated in 516, 517. People read about Zerubbabel, the guy who came back and kind of headed that up, faced some opposition. They rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem and Nehemiah. So that's how they got there.
Yeah, I feel like Nehemiah gets all the glory.
Nehemiah
there.
gets all the glory. He built some walls. He didn't even really build them. He managed the reconstruction of the walls, which was some decades after the temple was rebuilt. And so Ezra and Nehemiah weren't contiguous to the temple rebuilding. They come along a little bit afterwards. But Ezra's a very important guy. He comes back, reintroduces the law to people, to Torah to people, reads it. He has people help give their understanding because the Jews had been without that for over 70 years of captivity, really even longer than that, and or it's shorter than that when they're in captivity. But they don't have religious leadership. It doesn't get reestablished. And so at the end of the Old Testament narrative, the Persians are in charge of most of the ancient Near Eastern world, everything from what we would call modern-day Turkey to North Africa, all the way across to modern-day India. They have control. Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Jordan, Israel, all those countries were under that great Persian Empire. It's really the first world empire that we see.
So if the story is ending there around Nehemiah, what do we do with the rest of the Old Testament?
What do you mean?
Like, where does that fit?
Well, that's the end of the Old Testament.
No, I'm just saying in people's English Bible.
That ends, and then you have, and then you kind of have the chroniclers and the chronicle writings. We do have some prophets that we might say Haggai, Malachi, Zechariah. We already mentioned, Daniel's not really a prophet. He's more of a seer. But we see really Jeremiah kind of blends into the time of exile and Ezekiel, but not really into the time of the Persian period. And so they didn't live that long. But Zechariah, Haggai, Malachi, Haggai and Malachi are the ones who say, hey, you're rebuilding your houses since you've got restored. As the Lord promised you, you've been restored from captivity, and you've all built yourself some really nice houses, but what about my house? It still lays in ruin. So they're kind of the ones who prompt this. We see some prophecies in Malachi that relate to Elijah that are talked about in the New Testament. So we do have some prophets there in addition to Daniel and Esther that are in that time period. Esther is all about being a Persian queen. She's completely in the Persian realm.
Yeah. So it's just important for people to remember there that when you look at your Old Testament, it's grouped by genres, not that the last book is necessarily the end of it, and Nehemiah happened way before. Yeah,
some of them are in order. They're all the way from Deuteronomy through Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd, 2nd Kings. But you got to get on through. At the end of Nehemiah is not the end of the Old Testament, but time-wise, it is the end of that.
Yeah. All right. So what happens after that? Talk to us about that blank page in our Bible.
The biggest thing that happens in that time period is the conquest of Palestine by the Greeks. Many people have heard of Alexander III of Macedonia. We call him Alexander the Great. He branched out, conquered the Persian Empire for the Greeks, and he ruled a territory from modern-day Greece all the way to the Indus River Valley in modern-day India. He ruled Egypt and all the area that we would call the modern-day Middle East in that way. But his bringing of the Greek culture and language and philosophy, rhetoric, all the things that are Greek thinking, we see referred to in the New Testament sometimes as Hellenism or the Hellenists. And Hellas is the Greek word for Greek. And so that's why we pronounce it with an H sound, but it has a smoother breathing sound. Hellenists are people who have adopted Greek philosophy and Greek thought. And that was an issue for a lot of Jews because a lot of Jews began to move over to that thinking. And strictly Orthodox religious Jews may have thought, well, you're betraying your heritage in a sense. So there's some political tension that I think still remains. Even we see is the maybe even the lack of compassion for the Hellenist widows that we see in Acts when we see that their tables are not being waited on. There's some degree of separation. It's why the New Testament is written in Greek. Koine means universal in Greek, so Koine Greek is what's brought. Just that thinking, and also during that time period, after Alexander died, there were the territories that he conquered were divided amongst his generals. And the Seleucids and the Ptolemies are who kind of sat there and fought back and forth over Palestine. And some of the later rulers, the later Greek rulers, particularly Antiochus IV Epiphanes, or Epiphanes, however you want to pronounce his name, we see him kind of, I think, talked about in Daniel in a symbolic, prophetic way. They oppressed the Jews. They outlaw circumcision. They defile the temple by sacrificing a pig on the altar. They prohibit different things about the Jewish religion. They really oppress Jews terribly. My understanding is that mothers who circumcised their children, their babies would be killed and hung around their necks. I mean, it was terrible oppression, but they still chose to follow God's law of circumcision, even though that was the case, which is to their credit. So we see some of the sensitivities in the New Testament about circumcision being a mark of identity, dietary laws, Sabbath keeping, those things that we see that Jews really, really cling to as markers of their identity, and even things that continue to be dealt with in the book of Romans, the book of Galatians, the Hebrew writer. That's why they were so, I think it contributed to why they were so important to keep separated from the Gentiles, because those were things that their overlords tried to take away from them.
Yeah.
Keeping that identity.
It definitely changes that conversation when you recognize the history there and sacrifices that were made to hang on to those practices.
Well, think about it. If we as Americans had taken our right to vote and our right to free speech had been taken away for a period of time, and we restored those things, maybe through armed conflict, which is what the Jews wound up doing, how much more would we cherish those things if we knew somebody's trying to take we want that to make us different than other nations, than other things. Or, our ideology had been, if it had been taken away, the things that we hold true that make us different as Americans, the Jews had said these things and that's even, we don't have a religious connotation to our right to vote, even though some people think there is. They're taking away the things that God had told them, this is making you different. You are my people because you observe these things. I think it made it more sensitive and more important.
Yeah, and you see these things come up in several of Paul's writings, like in the letters, and you see it sprinkled throughout the whole New Testament there. So most people probably know at the time of Christ that the Romans are in play. So how do we go from Greeks to Romans?
Okay, yeah, you have just kind of even historically in the Mediterranean world, you have eventually the Greeks wind up gradually collapsing, and the Romans take over the period. And for a little bit of time, we don't want to skip over what's called usually the Hasmonean period. The Jews had gotten tired of these Greeks oppressing them, and they rebelled, a group called the Maccabees, which I think the name means hammer, a family traditionally. And these books of 1 and 2 Maccabees that we see in the apocryphal books we'll talk about in a minute, they contain that history. They rebelled, and they kicked off the Greek overlords, and they ruled themselves for about a century. The Jews finally restored their rule. And then the Romans come along. Pompey the Great conquers Jerusalem in 63. But they allow the Jews, allow is maybe the right term, to rule themselves as a client state of Rome. Rome is in charge, but kings that we even see talked about, like Herod the Great, he was really a puppet king he was still under Roman hegemony and under their authority. But like they did many things, we'll allow these people to govern themselves as long as y'all pay your taxes and you don't rebel against Rome. You can have your king, but eventually that doesn't work out. And Rome puts a governor in charge of that, like we see in the time of Pilate and Felix and Festus. They get more part into that. But Herod is a good example. And of course, Herod the Great died in about 4 BCE. He was the kind of the last Jewish king of Israel. Then it gets all divvied up amongst his very tangled family tree. But you do have a period that the Jews rule themselves, and then the Romans complete their conquest of the Mediterranean world, and part of that is taking over Palestine. About 63, I think, if my number is correct in my mind. So about 60 years before Jesus is born, the Romans are in charge, and they're in charge for the entire New Testament narrative.
So after the Greeks, what's some things that we see change when it comes to the religious side of things?
Yeah, it's important to note that we see what I believe is a corruption of the priesthood. It becomes very political and very, it seems like people almost buy their way into being a priest, and this concept of priest being of a descendant of Aaron or Zadok, and that being very tightly kept, that we see maybe like in the Old Testament period. I'm not so sure that didn't get kind of twisted and corrupted in that time period. And we'll talk about here in a minute. A lot of different institutions come about leading up to the time of Jesus, like the Sanhedrin, the concept of a synagogue, but the negative thing I think that we see from the Hasmonean period, in addition to the vicious politics that exist all the time, I think there's a corruption of the high priesthood, and that becomes almost a political position more than what I think God intended it to be for the people.
Yeah, it came at that time with a lot of power.
A lot of political power. That's right. Yeah,
like,
you could get killed. I don't think God intended people to kill each other over being the high priest in that way. But yeah, I think that's maybe the most important thing that we see. And then this development of what I call Judaism, because I think there's a difference between the Israelite religion. They still follow Torah, and there's a lot of similarities I know we'll talk about between the practices and the tenets of Second Temple Judaism versus the time of David or the time of Josiah. But there are some differences too, in just its structure and its practice, and two, as it spread throughout the world, as the Jews were dispersed. The diaspora is a good thing for people to know about in the New Testament. Why were there Jews in Berea and Thessaloniki? Because they'd been spread out. And so that Judaism was a little bit different than the Judaism in Jerusalem.
Do you want to jump into that, or do you got more you want to say about Rome before we?
No, I think most people kind of, if anybody's familiar with an ancient world empire amongst our listeners, they know about the Romans.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that Jesus was born in the time of Octavian, or he's called Caesar Augustus, which is more of a title than a name. He became the first citizen, the principate of Rome. There's not a word in Latin for emperor, but we call him emperor. And what we talked about with Herod the Great being under that, Jesus' entire ministry is under Tiberius Caesar. So most people are kind of familiar with the concept of Caesar and things like that. So I think it's better to spend more time talking about, especially going towards this series, okay, what were some of the religious things that happened and developed in that time
different than people's concept when they think about it.
Yes, when they think about it from a period of time. Keep in mind, there's 1,000 years between David and Jesus. Really even maybe more than 1,000 years, but around 1,000 years, the development and also the change that happens when you go into exile,
mm-hmm.
And the temple is destroyed, and all the changes that happen. There were some monumental things that happened in that time period.
Yeah. Walk us through some of those. What were some of the major ones?
One of the ones that I think we see that probably is maybe I won't say the biggest effect, but the maybe very oft mentioned is the concept of a synagogue. Mm-hmm. The Greek word synagogue really means to gather together. We kind of think about that with our concept of church today. That developed. We don't know the origins of that. Most people think they came from this thing called a prosuke, a prayer house that eventually developed into a synagogue that served a lot of purposes. It was kind of like not just a religious center, but a community center, maybe where Jews came together to discuss issues, or elders ruled on issues in that local area. And we see them spread out throughout the Roman world that Paul went to. I mean, that's the first place he goes, most places he goes, where there is one. I know there were places like, I think, Philippi that didn't have a synagogue. Mm-hmm. But that's where he goes, and that's real wise because everybody there believes in God already, so he doesn't have to convince them of that. But this concept of that developed somewhere in this time period. Scholars aren't real sure when or how, but obviously it is like an institution at the time, one that Jesus, in my opinion, endorses. He attends synagogue. He conducts a liturgical reading that we have recorded in the gospel in the synagogue. So obviously Jesus didn't think the synagogue was a bad place in Galilee or Capernaum where he does that. And so we see that. I think we also see the concept that go ahead.
Yeah, before you leave that, I was going to say, as a kid growing up, I viewed synagogues almost like as these like portable temples, and that's not at all.
No,
what
they were hard structure.
Like, I mean portable as in like they did exactly what was done at the temple at the synagogues.
Oh, I got it.
And the more recently, the more I've read about them is that's
no.
That's not at all what that was. Like where the temple, you have all like the sacrifices and all mm-hmm. that. Where the synagogues were more like you mentioned, a place of prayer. Discussions about scripture, like those things, not what you would normally think of at like the temple.
Yeah, a
where it's, like,
multifunctional place,
sacrifices.
but I think primarily with a religious function, and somewhere for Jews, especially in a community where they're surrounded by temples to Zeus or Jupiter or Hera or Athena or whatever it may wind up being in a Roman city. Synagogue almost like a refuge for you to go to.
Yeah.
We're so accustomed to there being a church on every corner. Imagine if there was only one church in New York City. That would be a very special place for Christians to be able to go to and gather in a place where it's surrounded by other things. And so outside of Jerusalem, that was very important.
Yeah. All right. So what about like the leadership?
I think the concept of a council, of a Sanhedrin that we see, that's obviously something we see mentioned in the Gospels that Jesus has to deal with and seem to have some degree of authority within Jerusalem and maybe even the surrounding region with a rope that is actually, or a leash that is actually held by a Roman government, but they're allowed a certain amount of leniency. Maybe there's some things they can't do, like, for example, ordering an execution. It seems that they have to get permission from the Romans to do that. And people might say, well, Stephen got stoned to death, but he didn't get stoned to death on orders of the Sanhedrin. He got stoned to death by an angry crowd that didn't appreciate what he had to say to them. So as far as an organ, I think they're kind of like a sub-unit of Roman rule, but mainly dealing with probably religious issues and think, what did Rome care? For example, what did they really care about Jesus until he said, well, he claimed to be king and not Caesar.
Pay us, keep peace.
Yeah, that's right. As long as you pay, and Jews were, they got a lot of leash because they weren't required to do military service, a lot of things that other people in Rome did. But a Jewish council that take care of religious issues, community issues, small disputes, that the Roman court didn't care about or didn't want to deal with. But I do think that the Roman government held the leash on that, and a very political group of people as well. And we even see maybe like a high priest involved with that, as we think about Caiaphas, for example, in the New Testament. So once again, we go back to what you said. The high priest had kind of become a politician.
Yeah.
One of the other things I think that's noticed that's embedded within that is Jewish sectarianism. And we think about some names we're familiar with from the New Testament. We think about Pharisees, Sadducees. Scribes weren't really a sect. They were more a group of people that studied the scriptures like lawyers, you might say today. But we don't want to think about a courtroom lawyer when we think about that, but people that were experts in the law, not necessarily a representative of an individual in a courtroom. But also zealots who were really, really, really didn't like Roman rule over them. We have groups called the Essenes, who some people think may have authored the Dead Sea Scrolls. We don't know that for sure.
They seem like an interesting group.
Whoever wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, they kind of have a lot of the same feelings that maybe Jeremiah might have or John the Baptist had, that the priesthood had become very corrupted, maybe even referred to as the wicked priest as an entity versus what they expected in a messianic expectation of a teacher of righteousness, that the vipers, the pit of vipers in Jerusalem were viewed as very corrupt. I think they would have probably agreed with Jesus on many things. Some people even think that maybe John the Baptist was a member of this sect, but we're not exactly sure if the Essenes wrote those scrolls or not. But they're a group. I classify Samaritans as a Jewish sect. I had an interesting discussion one time with one of my professors. He said, were Samaritans Jews? Well, in order to answer that question, I got to define what a Jew is. So we're talking about somebody that's an ethnic descendant of Abraham and one of the 12 sons of Jacob, or are we talking about people who participate in a particular religious practice? And so when I say, okay, a particular religious practice, I would say Samaritans had 1 foot in Jews and 1 foot in Judaism and 1 foot in Samaritanism. They had a different Pentateuch. They worshiped at a different location. We have to understand those things in order to understand a lot about Jesus' conversation in John 4 with the Samaritan woman. They did have a temple on Mount Gerizim. It had been destroyed by the time of Jesus. But they had their Samaritan Pentateuch is a very useful tool in textual criticism of the Old Testament.
You want to take another minute or two and explain kind of how they're different than other Jews there?
Other than, ethnically, what a Jew might tell you is they were the people who were left behind in the northern kingdom. Now, I think this is kind of a very, very generalization because this happened 700, nearly 800 years before. The Assyrians left some people, and very wisely, did not take every Israelite out of Israel, out of the northern kingdom. They left them behind to work the fields under their hegemony. And they intermarried with the Assyrians sent their people down there to control things, to be in charge of stuff. And the Samaritans are people who were probably viewed as people who intermingled with them. Remember, the northern kingdom is also called Samaria. There's even a province called Samaria in the New Testament. They would be viewed as people who maybe have for a long, long period of time, had interbred, if you will, with non-Israelites. And so maybe they had a checkered ethnic history behind them. I'm going to tell you that one of the things we have to realize is even Jesus didn't have a pure bloodline all the way back to Judah. He has a Moabite person in there in Ruth. He has, we were trying to think about the way to describe, a Jerichoite in Rahab, in it. So there are foreigners in the direct lineage of Jesus Christ. To thinking that people had a pure lineage with no contamination by any foreign person, for Jews to be able to say that, I think is an absurd proposition. When they went to Babylon, you tell me nobody intermarried with Babylonians. We know that they did because they're concerned about it. We see that in the Ezra and Nehemiah narrative.
But that didn't stop them from being on their high horse.
No, that's right. And so I think the negative view of Samaritans was from a very high-minded, highbrowed would be our way of saying it, arrogance to really, really think that any Jew could trace his lineage back and have no foreign contaminant in there whatsoever. So I think there's an ethnical discrimination against Samaritans, but they also had religious differences as well, primarily in their location for worship, we see. But they had a messianic expectation because if you remember the woman at the well, it said, hey, I know there's one to come. And Jesus is like, I'm him. She's like, okay, I'll go tell everybody about it. She seems to accept, like most women did and most foreigners did, she seems to accept Jesus just as his word, that he's the Messiah. And she's like, okay, well, I can. And Jesus obviously does some prophetic things there with her, but it's more of a racist issue, if you want my honest opinion, about Samaritans. But there is a religious divide as well.
Yeah. So with these three changes that we've mentioned so far here, how would you think Jesus viewed Judaism when he came on the scene? Like, we know we have times where he's like getting on to people. What did he seem to care about or want to correct them on? And what are some other things that he actually doesn't address?
Yeah, he doesn't seem to really have an issue with sectarianism. I mean, Jesus and even to his disciples seem to have a little bit of a barrier between them and the Samaritans, for example. Yeah, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. In doing that, and even Jesus even seems to have a little bit of an issue with that. I don't think, obviously, personally, in his mind he did. I don't think he has an issue with there being Pharisees and Sadducees. I think that he has an issue with the corrupted aristocracy that it had become. Also, if we think about the Pharisees who clung to an oral Torah, which had traditionally been handed down from Sinai orally, differently than the written Torah, where there are traditions, you might say, such as things that you can and can't do on the Sabbath. Jesus seems to have some issues with those additions, or maybe their strictness, or maybe their lack of sensibility. I would say lack of sensibility would be the first thing he has issues with, because he says, okay, I can't heal people on the Sabbath, but you can get your ox out of the ditch on the Sabbath, And so that doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
They lost the heart of
that's
law.
right. You might say they lost their first love or their understanding of, there's two reasons the Jews are told to observe the Sabbath, or the Israelites are, one of which is to remember that God created the earth and he ceased from his work on the seventh day. And the second reason that's given is to remember that your Lord brought you up out of Egypt. That's what we see in Exodus and Deuteronomy in that commandment on why you're going to observe the Sabbath. They had kind of lost that reasoning behind that. But I also understand. I probably wouldn't understand that either. What does it mean not to work on the Sabbath? Well, I got a guy, I think in the book of Numbers, that goes out to gather wood on the Sabbath, which seems very innocent. He gets stoned to death. Okay, well, can I pick up a stick on the Sabbath then? Mm-hmm. How do I make my hearth fire? Do I bake all my bread the day before? How far can I walk? But I think that had become too much. It had gotten too complicated. He doesn't seem to have an issue, like we talked about earlier, with the concept of a synagogue. Mm-hmm. Doesn't seem to rail against that at all. I don't know that he has an issue even with the Sanhedrin. That is, he has an issue with greed and money changers in the temple. He has an issue with people taking from widows. Yeah.
Self-righteousness.
It's corruption, self-righteousness, arrogance. Those things he seems to have an issue with. The state of the fact that there was a court of the Gentiles and a court of the women and all these things around the temple, Jesus doesn't seem to have many issues with what I would call the wholesome aspects of Second Temple Judaism that he was immersed in. I don't think he does.
Yeah. At least that's not what's highlighted in the records.
No, that's
like
right.
the things that he got onto them about and corrected about and wanted them to focus on. I just think it's kind of interesting there because I think sometimes we can be tempted to take what we read in the time of David and just like bring that forward to, well, that's the scene that Jesus enters on. And it's like two different worlds there.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you think about it, for most of the time of David, Jerusalem hasn't even become the center of worship. And there is no temple. I mean, it's his son that builds a temple, even though David desires to do that. And then and that temple didn't exist anymore. It had been built and expanded upon, it had been rebuilt, expanded upon by Herod. So that's why I always call this Second Temple Judaism, because it is different. Did they observe Passover? Yes. Did they observe the Day of Atonement? Yes. Did they observe Sabbath? Yes. All the core tenets didn't change, but the form and function and elements and institutions, there is a big difference, a huge difference. So I think it's important that we keep that separate. And like I said, people don't realize the scope of time. Think about how Christianity has changed. It's a good example to think about from the end of the first century, second century Christianity to modern day Christianity, goods, bad, and ugly. Boy, that's very different. Very different world. Yeah. The fact that we meet in a building, privately owned building, and have full-time employees at this church building would be a unheard of concept to a first century or second century Christian. In thinking about, well, what does that mean? Why do you do that?
Yeah. And I think just like with the Jews, I think there's freedom in some of that if you don't lose track of the core things. Yeah, the primary things.
There are great things about a synagogue, godly things about a synagogue.
All right, so what's some other things that we need to know about this time frame here?
I think the literature that developed during that time frame is very important. I know people get all up in arms about what we call apocrypha that are included in some Bibles. For example, you buy a New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, you'll have that. They're not thought to be, they don't have to be inspired scripture or canonical scripture to be useful for Christian studies. They absolutely give us insight, like we just talked about, the history between that time, their views of God, their concept of a Messiah, their concepts, there's expansion on story. They may not, even some of the narrative may be fictional, but it reflects the thought of people during that time period. And then there's a group of writings called the pseudepigrapha. Now, we say that word 3 times real fast. It's very hard. It really means false writing. There are books that are written, often they'll have a title like 1 Enoch. And it wasn't written by Enoch, the guy who we read about in Genesis. Or they may have the Testament of Moses. Well, it's not really the Testament of Moses, but they use these figures. And that would have been viewed as sacrilegious in its time. A lot of what we'll call apocalyptic literature similar to Revelation, where the eschatology, the series that we just had, certainly the eschatology, like you said, of Second Temple Judaism and how it developed and how it tied to and became part of Messianic expectations did not exist at all in the time of David. And so we have a lot of writings that reflect Jewish interpretation of Scripture, Jewish interpretation of the end of the world, of the coming of a Messiah. Those things are very valuable for New Testament studies because they help you understand the background. We don't say they're canonical, and that's fine. They don't have to be canonical, but they can be
just
informative.
like our libraries. We have a lot of books that.
That's right. They have a lot of books, but it really gives us insight into how many different ways did Jews interpret the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament? How many different expectations were there about a Messiah and what he was going to do and how the world was going to end, or not even the world going to end? How was a utopian age going to come in, and how was God going to judge evil and concepts that we talked about, like heaven, hell, Satan? Those are all things that we can learn about from those. And the Dead Sea Scrolls give us insight. They're contemporary. There's commentaries in the Dead Sea Scrolls on Old Testament books, and we are talking about writings that are very contemporary to the time of Jesus or the time leading right up to him, and thank goodness we have them. They are the oldest copies we have of the Old Testament, but all the other writings help us understand how did Jews view the world How did they view the priesthood in Jerusalem, for example? How did they view how the Messiah was going to come? And then a very important development in this time period is the Septuagint, or I say the Septuagint very loosely. There were different versions of it. Essentially, a translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, which allowed the spread of the Hebrew Scriptures, or what we call the Old Testament, all over the Greek-speaking world. I think that was what was read in the synagogues of the diaspora. The bulk of the New Testament quotations of the Old Testament seem to have their origins in that Greek translation. So very, very important for Judaism, really probably one of the most monumental things that happened in Judaism and the spread of Judaism throughout the Mediterranean world, and the ability for people to read the Scriptures who don't read Hebrew or Aramaic can read them in Greek. I think it's a monumental thing that happened in this time period.
Yeah. You referenced a couple times the expectations to a Messiah. Can you kind of walk us through maybe how that developed, or at least what do we know about different time periods of what they were thinking?
That's an area that I'm not an expert in. I have recently begun to read on because I want to understand more about this as we go through this series. But my basic understanding is post-exile, when they came back and they were under foreign rule, whether it be Persian or it be Greek or it be Roman, there is obviously a zeal for things to go back to the way they were when Israel was a unified country and their enemies were at bay and the land was flowing with milk and honey. And I would say that would be the time of Solomon. If I was going to pick a time, Solomon's day was the greatest glory of Israel. But there's a concept, and it's thought to be, or it is prophesied, that no one would fail to sit on David's throne, the throne of David continuing. Well, it didn't. It stopped. It stopped when the Babylonians conquered them, and it wasn't restored. You might say during the Hasmonean period it was corruptedly restored. Mm-hmm. But there is no kingdom of David, kingdom of Solomon. So that concept of that returning and the finding of passages in Isaiah and other prophetic literature that seem to hint towards that or indicate that. Now, I would make the case that they're not entirely clarified for Christians until they're used again in the New Testament. And sometimes they have dual purpose. Sometimes they may have been speaking of Hezekiah, for example, in the Old Testament, but then those same verses are used to describe Jesus in the New. That restoration of a Davidic throne is a desire for us to go back to having the land that God promised us and us restoring that kingdom of Israel in its glory days. Then I think that began to evolve into a Messiah that's going to usher in, not only do that, but usher in some sort of eschatological age, meaning either a time of judgment and of a utopian world, or the end of the world altogether. And so that's kind of what we recognize, like, for example, in our reading of the book of Revelation or in Jesus' Olivet Discourse, the concept of a Messiah who is going to usher in some new age, and there be some dramatic change in the defeat of evil and of corruption. The Dead Sea Scroll writers may say the teacher of righteousness is going to come and kick the wicked priest out of Jerusalem. That became to be part of that, and we see that reflected in writings as well. And so it's wrong to say all Jews believed in X about a Messiah. You might say many Jews, and obviously Samaritans as well, believed in a Messiah, but what they expected out of that Messiah would be very different amongst different groups in Jerusalem versus Jews in Corinth and Jews in Philippi or Jews in North Africa or Jews over in Babylon. If you lived in Jerusalem, the tension would be very high because you lived under a foreign rule in the land that God gave you. It's more offensive to a Jew that the Romans controlled Jerusalem than the Romans controlled, Philippi or Corinth, because they're supposed to control that land. The Jews were not given that land. They exist there as guests, you might almost say, or sojourners. So it's a very, very broad concept of a anointed one, which is what that word means. Anointed to do what? Because the two things that we see anointed people do in the Old Testament are two things: a king or a high priest. And so there, and we definitely see Jesus compared to that, for example, in the book of Hebrews. So what are they anointed? What is this Messiah going to be anointed to do? Now, did Jesus meet any of those expectations? That's the debate. I don't think he did physically. And I don't think if we had the New Testament without New Testament to explain to us the spiritual nature of his kingdom, we wouldn't understand it either. And I make that case by saying Paul, who I think is the smartest, sharpest, best educated person in the New Testament, didn't pick up on it either. He did not see Jesus as someone who was bringing about the expectations of Messiah that I guarantee you Paul was well schooled on in the Old Testament. All the passage, he quotes from all kinds of things. And so,
you're making a reference before the road to Damascus there, right?
Oh yeah. I'm talking
just
about.
Wanted to clarify that.
Paul didn't become. Obviously, Paul was very enlightened, and you think about how many years Paul says he spent receiving revelation from Jesus Christ. You know, he talks about that when he talks to the Galatians. It wasn't like Paul spent 15 minutes in Ananias' house after the road to Damascus, and he had all the answers. It's years that Paul gets these things revealed to him, and he understands more about the concept of what Jesus came and did. I mean, his own disciples didn't understand it.
Yeah.
And they were with him every day for 3 years. I mean, Peter still had a sword on him in the garden. You know, I think they were still expecting Jesus to overthrow the Romans or at least, you know, establish some kind of kingdom here on earth. I don't think any of them expected him to be crucified on a cross and be thrown in a grave, because, you know, they all freak out after he does that. And,
In our Sunday morning Bible class, we're beginning a series on David. And, you know, when I think about the comparisons to him, like you have physical success there, but you also have a period of time where they're right with God. So I could see why they thought both of those things would occur. Like not just being a religious side of it, but there being a physical kingdom where they gain dominance as well. Like it'd be crazy for them not to want that and think that.
Despite David's missteps in life and the tumultuous life that he had after his sin with Bathsheba, where he had just terrible things happen to him, he is a God worshiper, you know, and we're going to bring glory to God, and he wants to build a temple to God, which would be the ultimate achievement for a king, to be able to build his temple to his God. And he is a God-centered man, and Israel has no problem with idolatry under his rule. I say that very loosely. I mean, I'm sure there's probably places in Israel that was done.
Yeah.
But it is not like Manasseh or Ahab or something like that. It is a godly kingdom that David rules, and it's foretold that no one will fail to sit on the throne of David. But we know that wasn't literally fulfilled, because someone did fail to sit on the throne of David for many centuries. And so that's, comparing a time religiously, David was more a godly man than Solomon. I mean, it's Solomon that ran everything off the rails.
Yeah. So, hey, before we wrap this up here, anything else you want to share background-wise here before
No, the
week?
only other thing I would say is, and it's a very complicated term, but an apocalyptic worldview, which sounds very complicated, but we Christians have an apocalyptic worldview. We just don't call it that. You know, we long for a day. We believe that there's a struggle between good and evil going on spiritually. Whether you call it an angel sitting on one shoulder and Satan sitting on the other. But for the ancients, for Christians and for Jews of that time period, behind the curtain that they couldn't see behind, but every once in a while, you know, like John got a glimpse behind, the forces of evil of God and the forces of good of God and the forces of evil of Satan are banging heads together, and occasionally that spills over into this world. But in the end, God's going to set all things right. He is going to break into human history in a cosmic way. He's going to destroy and all evil. He's going to judge those who have not, and he is going to establish a kingdom or a heaven or whatever you want to call it, and the righteous people will be rewarded. They'll be vindicated. God will take his vengeance on his enemies in a huge way and usher in an age of peace and prosperity. And that worldview of what they had, and thinking that the reason we have evil in this world and think is just a consequence of the battle behind the scenes, is the same worldview we have in some ways. We just call it different things, and we don't believe in an agent. Well, some people believe on an age on this earth or a new creation type thing. We have that same worldview. We think Satan and God are in a battle for our consciousnesses and the consciousnesses of people and the world that we know it, and his agents are active and God's agents are active. And one day, God's going to rip apart the heavens and intervene in human history by sending Jesus Christ back again, and all things are going to be judged, and the scales are going to be balanced, and everybody's going to get what's coming to them. That's an apocalyptic worldview, and that is very present in the New Testament writings, and so it's good for us to understand that concept.
Yeah. Hey, Tim, I thank you for walking us through all that. I think that's some great background stuff for our series to the one they call Christ, but also helping everybody in all their studies of the New Testament and Scripture as a whole. If you have any questions or suggestions for future topics, let us know by emailing us at podcast@mountjuliet.org. To our fellow students of Scripture, thank you for joining us for tech support. We hope that you will join us next week.
This is a podcast of the Mount Juliet Church of Christ. You can find more personal growth resources like this one at mountjuliet.org/resources. The Mount Juliet Church of Christ exists to glorify God and make disciples by helping people grow in Christ, love one another, and serve others.